to order the Woodford County Board of Education Finance Committee, Finance Corporation meeting. Mr. Hawkins, you wanna? I think the only thing we have on the order, meeting
Is the election
agenda is the election of officers. So do we have a motion, nomination for chairman?
I nominate Debbie Elan as chair,
President.
president.
Second.
Motion is second. Are there any other nominations? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Now we need a motion or a nomination for vice president.
I nominate Danny Bradley for vice president.
Second.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Are there any discussion or other nominations? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? We need a secretary. Do we have a nomination for secretary of the Finance Corporation?
It's not on the agenda.
The other two would remain the same. I was already the
Okay.
secretary and Amy was already the treasurer.
okay.
So we
Okay,
just need
so-
our president, vice president.
Okay, so then Mr. Hawkins will remain as secretary and Ms. Smith will remain as treasurer. Have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion, meeting is adjourned. Now we will move into our special board meeting for the Woodford County Board of Education. Please note that all members are present. This is a work session for the 2021 budget, including revenues and expenses. I had asked for some information. I don't know if other members had to kind of review this and to just continue to look at this in a more detailed manner through a series of work sessions. So the one thing I'd asked for, and I don't know, Ms. Smith, if you had anything you were going to present to us, or you want to go ahead and do that first, and then we'll ask for questions.
Sure. So, I have a handout that I gave each of you. And, it, is a revised version of the draft budget that was approved back in January. And this, was created at the request of some of the questions that came about when we were talking about some of the other discussions earlier back in February about Superintendent Hawkins, the scenarios in order to keep our budget in balance and concerning the deficit of the draft balance or draft budget. So what this is the draft budget that was approved with one exception, primarily a version of the budget if the $950,000 were not restricted upon this budget. So that's what this version is. The second change to this budget and is that in discussions about the budget and how it has, and this, it's always been presented and questions that came from regarding the deficit that was proposed in the budget. I have made an attempt to hopefully help explain this a little bit better. Ultimately, our budgets, if you go back to our procedure, we have had a pot of money that is our operating cash, and as I have explained many times before, we have a need to make sure that we are able to sustain our operations from July until November, when we get our actual tax money, which is the majority of our revenues for the year. It doesn't come in equally. primarily, that money, the first amount comes in November. So the practice has always been since I've been here, and it is that we have embedded some operating budgets within our budget. And if you look back at all the budgets I've presented, there is a beginning balance and there is a contingency and there is a difference. It's not always equal. And the difference is that operating cash. So what I've done with this particular budget is I have pulled out the 950, and I've pulled out that operating cash so that it is no longer reflected in any of the other line items. My attempt was to basically shore up all of those individual budgets to where they're as close to what I think their actual is going to be, and show that operating budget as a separate line item. So if you look at the handout that I gave you, you will start at the very top. It has total expenditures without on behalf payments and contingency and operating expenses. So this is the 30,332,000. That is all of page 1 through 5 added together. Okay, so in the original presentation that I made back in January, I pulled out the on behalf payments because again, that's not real money. It's in and out. Revenues we have to recognize. Expenditures we have to recognize. So I pulled all that out. I had also pulled out the contingency in the draft presentation, and so I have done that in this presentation as well. Like I said, the only change is that $1.8 million that I've pulled out of the expenditure budget to show it's separate. So it is no longer embedded in any of the other line items to help try to clarify what that is. So if you go back to the draft budget, you will see that the revenues, the new revenues are the same. There were no changes to those new revenues. The only difference you're going to see on the revenue side is that beginning balance, and the change is exactly $950,000. So if the board chose to reverse that decision and those monies were no longer restricted, and which means they would not be spent in FY20, which increases our end of year balance. That becomes our beginning balance for the next year. So it's a flow through, and if you do the math, it's $950,000. The total revenues, again, these are new revenues. The 30 million is brand new. They did not change. Payments did not change. Now, you will see that in the previous budgets that I gave you back in January, there was a significant deficit. Under this scenario, the deficit is right around $300,000. Now, part of that, to clarify a statement that Mr. Hawkins said earlier when he was making the recommendation that a way to alleviate this deficit is if the restriction were removed. We specifically mentioned that if that restriction were removed, we could recover all of this year's and prior years. I just found out yesterday, day before, that actually what is in the construction fund, the initial $600,000 that came from FY19, it cannot automatically go back to the general fund if that BG1 is canceled. So I thought that we could, because I thought that the monies that are in that construction fund, as I've said, we put approximately $1.2 million in cash. That came from $600,000 of the general fund. The other 600 or so thousand came from our capital outlay dollars from FY19 and our balance in our building fund from FY19. I thought that you would spend the most restricted first In actuality, KDE has let me know that, in their opinion, you spend the least restricted first. So, if we spend $800,000 of the 1.2 million on architect fees, the surveys that the board has approved, all of those things, it is assumed that we spend the general fund money first. And the money that would be left over is actually the restricted. The only way we can access that money is through a capital funds request. So, if we did have a residual there that was created, if that BG1 were to be canceled, the only way we could get through that or get to that would be through capital funds. It would be possible to make that request and say, let's request it to be spent towards our insurance payment. If that were to happen, then we could essentially zero out that deficit, and it wouldn't be there at all. So that's the difference between what we had said earlier about if this was unrestricted, how it would affect it, and what I'm showing you now is because that is not an automatic that it goes back to the general fund.
I am honestly, this is just, it floors me. The entire time that this board agreed to restrict that $600,000, that was based on Debbie having a conversation with Shay Ritter at KDE and presenting to us as fact that that could be unrestricted, that we could unrestrict that money and return it to general fund.
So
Was that
this
my
year,
conversation? Did you have a conversation with
I
us?
did have a conversation with Shay.
Yes.
and
Not
he
when we restricted this money. When we restricted, that came from the board. The board, Debbie called
It did
Shay
not
Ritter.
The
come from
difference-
Debbie.
Debbie
It
came to a meeting, and we all agreed we would do that if we had the option of unrestricting it.
But here's the difference. The difference is that between the moment that the board restricted the 600,000 and the conversation and the statement that we could unrestrict it, the board passed the BG1 in June of 2019. And once it became part of that BG1, it became more restricted than it was prior to that. So that's the difference.
Okay, but what I'm hearing you say is that
But
we
now,
can in
the
fact unrestrict
600,000
that.
going forward,
Okay,
this year going forward, that could be. The only thing that can't be is what's attached to that BG1, and right now, that's the 600,000.
Are you surprised it can't be unrestricted because of your conversations with Shay?
Well, in essence, the recurring $600,000 can be unrestricted. It's just the initial 600,000 that was attached to the BG1 that was approved in June. And I guess really, no, I'm not surprised, but I was
I
surprised.
have no memory of me reporting that. If I did, I really have no memory of it. I do remember asking, can it be unrestricted in the future, and the answer was yes.
That was if it was not tied to a bond. So that was
Right,
one
we knew
caveat.
once we sold it to a bond.
I don't think anybody asked if we had put the cash and restricted it on the BG1 if that was a scenario.
If a
I
board
don't think
member,
that
let
was
me just
required.
ask Mr. Hawkins this. If a board member brought to you a report, and I have no memory of this, would you double check that because with Trey? Or
Double
would you
check
rely on me that this could be unrestricted, or would you rely on a board member?
He confirmed to this week that the 600,000 that has been restricted, the recurring can be undone.
Mhm.
It's just the initial 600,000 that was attached to the BG1. That's the only monies that I am saying is still restricted.
And so when we passed the BG1, was that information presented to us that
it could be
once we pass the BG1, the 600,000 can no longer be unrestricted?
I don't
think we
recall
were
that
aware
that
of
was,
That
I
was
don't think that
presented
was,
to us.
no.
And just to be, just to follow up, so we had a board member bring the idea of restricting the 600,000. We were told it could be unrestricted at any time. If it didn't work, if it caused problems, if it led to deficits, that could be undone. We were told that. And so I voted to restrict it. I voted and said, yeah, let's try this. And now to find out that we really can't unrestrict it, it sounds like, I don't know if we just need to authorize Mr. Hawkins and you to have some conversations with him about what our options might be, or
Well, our
Well, we do-
options is
we do
that
have
we
some
have the
options.
capital funds
We
request
can-
process, so
we
we
can
can
do a
still
capital
access.
funds
pay our
request.
insurance, which
So-
would take it out of our
Right.
general
It
fund.
essentially,
Yeah,
Would balance out.
yes, it essentially gives us the opportunity
Yeah.
to unrestrict that in a different way.
It's just
In
a
a
different
specific
pathway.
It's just, yes,
Way.
it's just a
You have
specific
to say
way.
it
Well,
needs to be
thank you for
unrestricted.
coming up
Yes.
with a plan to kind of get us out of
Yes.
that mess.
okay, let's, are you done, Sherry? Do you have any more questions?
No, and then just to clarify, so, it sounds like you have a plan, you've already thought about this. If we unrestrict now and you're able to recover some of that money, then we wouldn't have a deficit. So there is no need for any cuts, and we don't have a spending or expenditure over revenue problem, because the revenue is more than the expenditures when you take out the high school restriction. We're fine. So there's no overspending problem, and it sounds like you have a plan where if we unrestrict, that you can recover some of that money to use for other things, and it will kind of balance out. Thank you.
So the 30,332,000, which is different than the initial, can we kind of go through where the draft budget is different again?
The difference is the 950,000.
But you said you removed some of the embedded costs.
Correct.
Correct.
the
So where did
1.8
those
That's the
occur?
1.8 million.
There's
See,
a
1.8,
variety.
Do you need
And
to
How many
decide?
line, are there different line items that
yeah,
you can point to, or was it every line item that changed from?
No, it's not every line item.
but let me go back here just for a second on that. And I think what's important to note too is that this is the way that we have done our budget since 2012, is that we show our operating cash in different expenditure line items. And part of that is so that we have the cash available to be able to do the things that we need to do between July 1 and November. So this is a common practice that we have done. And so what we are trying to do is to say, if you go through all the different line items that we have within our budget, we pulled out the 1.8 million that was the operating cash, and showing that separate so that you can see this is what we believe our projected revenue is going to be, this is what we believe our projected expenses are going to be. And so you can see that it's basically a $300,000 difference deficit, but we do have an option to be able to offset that through a capital funds request to pay for, again, like our property or liability insurance that we would typically pay for out of the general fund.
So if we unrestricted the 600, that would cover that with a capital outlay request. What about next year? Would our expenses be more than our revenues, and we wouldn't have
This
that
is a
other-
projection of next
I
year.
mean, the year after, like, there would not be a,
I have
I
not
guess-
created an FY22 budget.
yeah, well, no, I know, but if you think if our expenses are gonna stay the same, we're not gonna cut, they'll probably go up with inflation a little bit.
And we don't have that building fund to dip out of.
Yeah.
Well, we're not really dipping out of the building fund. All we're doing is kind of restoring that 600,000 from
The
the
building
first
fund.
restriction that we couldn't get back any other way.
But
So
it's
once
in
you
the building
restore
fund.
that,
But
but
it's-
once that's restored, then moving forward, your income outpaces your expenditures again. So this problem of
But it
deficit was
doesn't.
only created,
What do you
because
mean
you
it doesn't?
restricted
So-
the money for the high school. And once that's put back in, you don't have that problem.
Can I go back to my question? I'm sorry, let's just get it. Okay, so you're saying the difference between 31,825,314 and 33,321,25 is 950,000? It's not exactly.
Well, it's the 950 plus the 1.8 million. Because I pulled out, or the 1.8 million. Yeah, that'd be that. And then the 350 I put back into the contingency. So the 1.8 plus the 350. Because I put the 350 back into contingency because that was specifically removed from contingency.
For the revenue. I'm talking about the revenue line, the total,
No.
oh, yeah, total expenditures, okay.
Yeah, total expenditure.
So that's, this 33,321,25 plus the 1.8 and the 350 is where you got the 831,825,314 on your initial budget?
Yeah, I think that's what it adds up. I don't have a calculator with me, and I didn't do that exact scenario.
Yeah, I
But
don't
yes,
think
I
you did,
think it
because it
does.
would have been, yeah,
I
but it's
think- I
close,
think
it's in there, okay. And then what other line items changed between this and the, I'm trying to go down here, so the estimated beginning balance changed, which of course was that, putting money back in the contingency, that would have been that.
Sorry.
That's
None
not the
of the other
full.
revenues changed.
And I didn't bring the full original.
And I think basically when you go back to the recommendation that Mr. Hawkins made, it was clear that restoring those funds takes care of the deficit problem. The problem is not we have too many expenditures and not enough income. The problem is that we're taking out of our general fund to set aside for this high school. And in year one, when we did that, fiscal year ended 19, that caused us to be about $1 million in deficit spending. This year, we're on track to be over $1 million in deficit spending. And if we don't make corrections, this is for the fiscal year 2021, we're looking at, if we don't do any unrestriction, we're looking at 1.8 million in deficit spending. But
now,
according to the plan, the scenario, the recommendation for cuts that you presented, Mr. Hawkins, when I look at that, what I saw was that by restoring this general fund money, and then I guess the capital outlay would also be restored, and then the 600,000 that we can't get any other way now, we can kind of restore that by Amy's scenario, that we don't have a deficit spending at all. There's no problem with our expenditures outpacing our income. That's not a real issue. It's only an issue created by taking this general fund money and setting it aside for the high school. And if we return that, then there is no overspending or expenditure issue.
So Debbie, just to answer your question, if you look at page 1,
Okay,
there is a district operations and maintenance. So that number is going to change when you compare this to the original. And then if you look at page 2, you'll see district-wide board paid, the substitute budget and there's some other things in there. You'll see that number changed. And then if you look at transportation, you'll see that number changed. Those are your 3 primary areas that make up
so you can, transportation,
district-wide board paid. And that's on page 2. So 1, 2, and 5 are where you're gonna see those changes. To answer your specific question.
the third one again, I'm sorry.
Transportation.
I need the
Got
first
that.
one.
Transportation, district-wide, board paid, and
The first one is district operations and maintenance at the bottom of page 1.
Oh, that's not on my page one. There we go. Okay.
Are you looking at my?
I'm looking at the draft, but you're looking at the.
I'm looking at this, what I gave you all tonight.
flip it all the way over, Debbie. Page 1 is the last
Okay.
page.
District operations and maintenance?
Yes, and then if you look at page 2, you will see district-wide board paid. And then if you look at page 5, you will see transportation.
And then mainly the difference is that you didn't put in those amounts that would cover the first few months. So what is the actual, let's say if we didn't have that, you know, our cash comes in November, which one of these numbers is the actual expense for the year?
That is the 30,332,000.
Okay.
That's what I'm estimating as our actual.
Okay,
So
so when you
nothing-
did the 31, that was really kind
It
of.
included that 1 point, yes.
Right, so it kind of double included because you were putting in what would cover us from July through November. What are the actual expenses July through June? Was it
The
34?
30,000,003.
Right,
Yes. No, I didn't add it twice.
you just added some extra to get us through the first part, but once we get our
Right.
taxes.
Well, I don't move it back to contingency. That
Right,
would be the only
exactly.
option.
So, I mean, I guess I'm just saying, what is the actual expense? Let's try to forget about our cash
30,332.
flow. Right, 30 minutes, okay.
30,332,000.
So,
that's why that first budget looked over, because we were
Because
making a
I had-
pad for those first few months.
Yes.
And so the expenses were over to create that pad to pay for those first few months, but the actual expenses are less than on the draft.
And if you look back at the last every year that I've been here except 19, we have added anywhere from $1 million or so to the ending balance.
Which is why our expenses are always kind of less at the end of the year, because we have added a pad. And I don't mean counting them twice, but you see what I mean. You are putting a little bit of a pad above what you think the actual expenses will be to create, you know.
To create that
Some
operation.
Right.
operating cash.
Cash,
So,
so,
yeah.
yes.
So
But
you
then-
could almost
but then-
put that,
But then it shows through
Then
at
it
the end
shows
of,
up at the end of the year
at
as
the
part of the
end of
ending
your
balance.
balance.
right,
Okay, so
so the actual.
if we put those things back in, the way that you guys said you have every single year, then we would have a deficit. Even, so it's 1.8 million, the operating costs from July to tax money. And if we restored the full 950, then we're back to the projection of like a difference of 800. No,
It's not a deficit.
I mean, this is showing
That is,
only a
we-
$300,000 deficit.
right,
if
but
it's all
I'm
restored.
saying, if you put it back to the way that you've always done it, you put that 1.8 in operating costs back in those line items.
You are, if you wanted to show a deficit, we could show a deficit.
Oh, I
No,
think
we
we
don't.
did.
But no, what
No,
she's-
but I'm just saying though, but that is the way that we've done our budget for 8 years. There is
exactly, and that's
never-
what she's saying, and if
So
you do
what-
it like you've done it for 8 years, it would be like the draft budget.
Exactly.
But
And-
there's, nobody's ever had a question about it. And so this is where I'm struggling, is that we have done this budget the exact same way since Amy's been here, starting in 2012. We show that in our expenses and the draft budget so that we have operating cash to be able to cover expenses from July until, and then at the end of the year, every year up until FY19, we've never had a deficit.
Okay,
And then that money then goes back to our end of year balance
Yeah.
to show where we are. So
Okay.
there will be no deficit.
but, so now, I understand that completely. So if we restore it back to the way you've always done it, then this number is now,
So on paper,
yes,
on the budget,
Yes.
yes, it would show a deficit,
Okay.
as it always has. But I know this money, what this money is for, and it is truly not obligated to anything specifically.
But it's not deficit spending either.
But it's not
No.
deficit spending,
okay,
that is correct.
but then when you present the budgets to set the tax rate, do you give the real number and the increased number to the board? Do you say, this budget includes 1.8 million in pad? Or do you just say, here's what the budget looks like?
I do not use that terminology.
Yes.
What I do say is that we have to protect our beginning balance because we have to have enough cash
Sure,
to
and-
get through those months. So I do say, I feel like I say that in a just different terminology.
And you've made that perfectly clear over the years, and I think there's nobody that doesn't understand that we have a little bit of a cash flow issue because of when we get our tax, because of when our fiscal year starts,
Right.
and because of when we
Payments.
receive our tax.
But no, I've never
but-
used the terminology, I just pad it to.
Well, I
Because
know, and I
it's
use it
not-
just, yeah. And
I don't
I'm-
view it as that, I
I'm
view
not-
it as being physically
You-
responsible
Sure.
to make sure
And I understand that, I'm not
that we don't
implying,
have.
I'm just asking
And
in
that's
both
what-
scenarios.
And that's why when we talked before, about our contingency, how much of that is really contingency and how much of it is just operating cash?
No, the 4.3 is contingency.
And to be fair,
But we
Amy
use it.
presents us this every month. We get presented the summary of our budget. She stands up and presents it. There's a
And that's
special
cash,
pull-out
that's not even
box
the budget.
that tells exactly
That's not the
what
budget,
your
Yeah.
unassigned
that's
beginning
cash.
balance, it tells exactly what your working budget, and
Cash
then
balance.
you can see exactly what your operating cash is by subtracting. I mean, it's there. And we've had multiple work sessions where you've been very clear that we have to pay our bills over the summer, even when our revenue doesn't come in until tax time in November. And how we do that is we have to dip into this contingency fund and then it is restored. That's just how it has to happen. I would guess that's how it happens for most districts. That over the summer, you're not getting that revenue, but you still have to pay your folks. Over the summer, you're not, having, which is, again, is why it's important to keep a good contingency and keep an operating balanced budget. But again, I don't feel like we've padded it in any way. When you report it for the taxes and we do that notice, it's not added in twice or anything. So.
Okay. Once again, I've used the wrong word, and I can see it on Facebook today. What I meant was that you were just, you're creating that buffer, you're including it in the budget to get us through those first 4 months, but that's not actually, but like you just said, that is not included in our actual expenses. Our actual expenses are $1.5 million less. What you put in the draft budget was just a buffer, extra to get us through there.
And then when what we try to look at anytime that we do tax rates is we try to again look at our projected expenses. We try to look at, are there any additional costs that are going to be passed on to us? Are there opportunities where we may want to try to do a raise or do some other things maybe that we haven't done in the past? And so would additional revenue be needed? But at the same time too, for the first several years that I was here, we also had a conscious effort that we wanted to build our contingency to a certain level. And so part of those additional dollars helped us accomplish that as well. So it's been a very conscious effort in terms of how we've gone about this. But also those are the things that we look at when we try to recommend a tax rate.
Okay. Ms. Smith needs to leave at 6:30. I don't know what time it is. You took the call.
6:06.
Yeah. Okay. So if anybody has specific questions for Ms. Smith, go ahead. Does anyone else have any questions? I had asked you a little bit about transportation. Were you able to put anything together on that?
Yeah, let me grab my notes. So, we have, I deal with a lot of numbers, so I don't always go by memory.
You can read them.
We have a total of 38 routes, but we need 42. The reason we have,
Okay, go ahead.
we do not have 42 is because we do not have 42 bus drivers. We have a driver shortage. We currently have 51 buses, but 3 of those buses, one of those buses is completely out of service, and it's basically for parts. So that gets you down to 50. We have 2 of those buses that are not very old buses that are not safe to be put on the road, so those are not options either. So that brings you down to 48 usable buses. 3 of which of those 48 are special needs buses, so they're very limited. That they're not available for if a bus breaks down and it's a 72 passenger. Those 3 buses are not available for that. So that basically gives you 6 spare buses. We have, we have 12 buses that are out of depreciation, so that means they are over 14 years old. We do have some gaps. If you look at the year that our buses are bought, we have a couple of years where we bought 6 buses, and then we have 3 years where we bought 0. So we're still trying to recover from that. Keep in mind, if they're not under depreciation, we're getting nothing in that calculation for our seat. So
there were years in the last.
Before
Yeah. Okay.
it was like
I was gonna say.
2002, 2003.
Yeah.
There were no buses.
Right,
Maybe in 2004
okay.
there was a.
You just started
Yeah.
with me for a minute, but you're talking before.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the 14 buses that
depreciation.
So the 12 that are out of depreciation are part of this 48.
So, if we have 46 buses divided by 14, the state recommends that we buy 3.2 buses a year. Obviously, we round down to 3, and that's where we get our replenishing cycle. Now,
And even
my
doing
first
that,
3
we're
years,
driving.
we did 4 buses, but that
Right.
was trying to get caught up.
Caught up.
Once we felt like we were definitely in better shape and
Yeah.
had better buses, then we,
Okay, so we have 48 buses. 2 buses are not safe for the road, so what are we doing with those? We're gonna scrap them, salvage them?
We'll probably
will
sell it.
probably
Yeah.
put them in surplus.
Okay, and then, so we have 48 buses, but 3 are special needs, which takes us to 45. If we were running all of our routes, we'd have 3 extra buses.
But
Okay.
12 of those are out of
12 of them
depreciation,
are out of
which
depreciation.
means what for the seat?
If they're not calculated, so we're not getting any funded.
It's a
Head funding,
14-year depreciation
14-year
schedule, so once you
depreciation.
go, so these buses are over 14 years.
And they're probably on the higher needs of maintenance, so they cost more. And so every time a bus is not bought on the rotation, it just pushes the cost down the road. That's just the way it's structured.
So even with 3 buses a year, 25% of our buses are out of depreciation.
Well, that's what
As long
it
as
is right now.
as long as we maintain
Because we really
the
haven't
3.
recovered from the early
years ago.
2000s when buses weren't bought.
If you think about
Do you
it,
think
if
we
we
will?
want 42, if we would ultimately like to have 42 buses routes going, if that is our kind of our ideal number. If you're buying 3 a year and they depreciate over 14 years, that's 42. And so that's the optimal place that we want to be. And we just want to continue on the path that we're on in terms of buying that 3 per year.
But because we don't have enough bus drivers, we basically have 4 buses sitting there.
Well, they're used.
Well, they're used, but
Yeah.
I mean, but they're not used like they would be used if we
Right.
had enough bus drivers. So
Right.
we have like 4 buses that aren't used every day, like
Well-
should be. Are those the new buses usually, do you know? Or do,
Not necessarily, no.
hopefully it's
So,
part of these 12 that.
Sometimes a route may need an 82 passenger, but the trip in the afternoon only needs a 72. So the 72 bus may not be on an everyday route, but it's used every day because we have trips. And the driver will come in and get a small, I mean, there's a lot of different
Sure,
scenarios.
sure, but I'm
And
just saying we have to.
I don't think that,
We
I
plan
don't
our.
think we have buses that just sit there and are not used, that are,
Well, I
Right.
guess I'm just thinking, and I'm not saying anything, I'm just asking. We're purchasing and depreciating and planning for 42 bus routes, but we only have 38. So there's 4 buses that I wonder, do they just sit there and depreciate, and by the time but their lifespan, their lifespan is being extended because they're not being used every day because we don't have enough
Well,
routes to run.
but part of it, I know we had at least 39, if not 40 routes in the first semester, but we had 2 people retire at Christmas. So
But
2
you
of
see
those
what
buses,
I mean,
I know, but,
Do
and
you see what
again,
do you see-
I understand what you're saying, and I
Yeah.
think ultimately though, I don't think you not buy buses because you can't
Yeah,
find
just-
drivers. I think your goal
Right, 'cause
is
then
how
you
do
get
you
behind
recruit,
again.
how do you recruit more
and
people?
she's currently trying to recruit. And
Yeah.
that doesn't
Sure.
mean that she's not in the process of training someone and they could start next week.
Right, but when I'm just,
That
And
can
you
change.
can have a flat tire or a bus not start. If
You've
you don't
gotta
have a
have-
bus to replace that bus, you've got a whole route of kids
right,
not
but
going to
if we
school that
had, if
day.
we had 42 routes, we wouldn't have that extra route.
Well,
Well, we'd
we
have
do
a
now.
few, but
Yes,
not
we
as
do
much.
now.
Yeah.
We've
We
got
do
some
now, but
spares
we
now,
would,
yes.
but now we have like 4 extra because we're not running our ultimate number of routes. And I just wonder how that works with the depreciation, though. That's what I was curious about.
The
Like-
depreciation is strictly
Yeah, it's set, so you
limited to
Right,
buses that are less than 14 years old.
You might have a bus sit there kind of for a year because you don't have a driver for it, but we're getting money from it for seed.
Does that ever happen?
I don't
The bus
think that,
wouldn't
I mean,
touched?
if we've got 4 or 12 buses that are out of depreciation, and,
I just think these 4
I
buses
mean,
that we're
that's-
not using could.
yeah, but if you take 48 usable buses minus the 12, that's 36 buses. So that means the 36 newer buses are all on the
Every
road, and
day.
we're still using 2 more that are out of depreciation on the routes every day.
But
So
some-
there's
some of
not
the-
any,
Yeah.
I would not expect that any of our buses that are newer are not being used on an everyday basis.
Right, right. It just
So
doesn't
that's
seem
too
like we would
short.
have that many out of depreciation if we're not using it, but, okay. Okay, thank you.
And then just to clarify, the state recommends that for our specific situation, in our specific district, that we replace those buses 3 a year. That's their recommendation.
Well, so what they want you to do is they want you to take your number of routes and divide it by 14. And that's,
Just the number of years that
Yeah.
it depreciates for us.
So that their recommendation would be 3 a year. Thank you. I knew you recommended it, but I wasn't sure why.
Yeah, I think it's just important for us all,
Yeah.
because, and then when I was at, and I talked to Scott a little bit about this. Do you know how many propane buses we have? I mean, everybody did their,
We bought
they're
2
all
more, so we're getting
ready.
ready to have 5.
Well-
We'll have 5 at the end of this year.
Because the way it was presented to me, and
Because
I
we've
don't know if
got
this
3
is-
now, and she's ordered 2 more
we've
this
got 2
year.
more, so we'll have
So
5.
we'll have 5 by the end of the year. That's the thing about it, and it's like when we order buses, we ordered them in the fall, we won't get them till the spring.
Yeah, we won't get these
So
until,
they run about 5 or 6 months behind in terms of, because they
well, they have to
build
make
them, they actually
once
build
we
them when you order them.
Okay,
So,
because this thing I went to, I mean, it was presented, and I don't know, you have to take this, you know, there's always 2 sides of it, like, why would anybody not buy a propane bus? The only reason to not have all propane buses was if you go out of town and you can't find a fueling
Yeah.
spot. So you have to
There's
have,
limited.
you have to have enough for field trips out of town, but, I wonder if we've done any calculation, because I know they cost a little bit more, maybe 3,000 more or something. That was the
They're very
information
close.
they told me at
Yeah,
this
they're pretty
meeting.
close.
it's hard to say what
The
will
fuel's less.
savings in the maintenance, because we've only had them for a
Yeah,
couple
the
of years.
maintenance is supposed to be a lot
Yeah,
less.
and I think our folks like
Well, they're
working
so
on.
new, they're,
Yeah.
I mean, we're doing oil changes and.
Well, they just don't
fueling
have
and
as many parts as diesel, like, they just don't have the complexity.
So,
And they're so quiet, they said that just the behavior on the bus is so much better because they're quiet and people aren't trying to be heard. So I'm not sure, I don't know what Kay thinks about that, or she just
Yeah, she's been very
Yes.
pleased with the,
Very pleased.
with the,
So we could
with
just-
the propane buses.
buy those and going forward would be great, so, hopefully.
I mean, the
And
things
they
we have to
also
look at.
provide, that what they told me, and I might have told you this, Amy, that they provide, like usually your fuel, the person who provides the propane
Mhm.
will provide the station. Like
Yes,
they
and it is
build
my
it
intent
on the
to-
place.
We're gonna bid out propane this year.
Good.
Nice.
And we're,
And then they'll
um,
provide this fueling
yes.
station.
We've got to build a
we've
concrete
got to build a,
barrier
which
for it to be
is
stored in,
not gonna be
basically.
an expensive
Okay.
process. And, whoever wins that bid will
So it would
install
be
propane.
interesting to see what effect this has on our budget with propane going forward, if we can analyze that and just see what our savings are.
I think the other reason too, the reason that the depreciation piece is so important is we are funded so poorly in transportation already. So the more buses you have out of depreciation, the less funding you're actually getting, which just increases your overall cost in terms of what we're paying for transportation, in addition to the maintenance and everything else on top of it. So that it
So
just
if
it just
anybody
becomes
is,
problematic.
wants to take their energy and go to Frankfurt and make sure we're funded better for transportation, tell your representative.
Well, and I would just say thank you. I mean, I appreciate, like, every time we come to a meeting, it seems like you've gone above and beyond with the ideas about, you know, trying to capture that money we restricted a few years ago, that 600,000. And then, again, above and beyond with the propane buses and bidding the propane and looking at all of those things. Really, almost, it seems like on a daily basis of how can we save money, how can we do this better, what are some ways to do this. And I just want to say, Mr. Hawkins, I do appreciate that. You and Amy and all your staff does a really, really good job with that.
Are there any more specific questions for Amy?
And I'll be here for another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
So.
Do you have something you want?
Yeah, I don't think I articulated my question very well. So, looking at the document that you had with the 5-year projections, the deficit increased each year. So what I was asking is, assuming that we restored everything, and you restored the total amount to cover the July to November timeframe, back to that, we still have climbing costs as each year progresses, right?
Mhm.
So what we can possibly restore is a finite number that has been restricted. So we would still have to take increased tax revenues every single year to keep up with those climbing expenditures at the levels we're at now.
I wouldn't say that that is a for certain.
But this is what you
That
presented.
is based, now again, we showed different scenarios. We showed one with 4% increase in
Sure.
assessments, one with 2% increase in assessments, one with, leaving the rate flat. So we showed multiple options. I think part of what we do with a 5-year projection, and again, that's very difficult to do because we don't know what state budgets are going, that's based on today's factors, that projection, okay? So, given the fact that we would be made whole at this point in time, we are in a much better position moving forward to look at revenues and expenses to make any kind of determination in terms of the tax rate.
Okay, and so knowing that, do you not think that there's any expenses that we need to review currently?
I think we always try to look at our expenses each year.
And the $300,000 that you identified,
I can assure you that we look at each department's budgets each year. We would have come back to you with a recommendation on the teacher incentive pay for attendance pay to remove that going forward. Because we made a commitment that we would look at that at the end of this year to see if it was making a difference. That's something that we would have brought back to you.
okay,
So we look at those each year.
so
But,
stay on that one for just a second.
but do I go in and say, I'm gonna slash areas? No.
No, and that's not what I'm implying. So you will recommend not doing that, so that's a $50,000 savings going forward, right?
Mhm.
Okay, and are there any other items like that that you are planning to review that you're,
I think any of those other items that I had presented as part of that 300,000, I think the board could look at and determine if you wanna take action on those. So that's completely up to you. You know, again, I think the big thing going forward is if the funds are unrestricted, it puts us back in a much more safe and healthy financial position so that I think those things are not a have to reduce, but you can look at them a little bit more closely and say, is that something that we want to do? Or would we rather keep them in place? Is there a benefit to them that now that we don't have to cut them, is there enough benefit that we'd like to keep them?
sure, but like I said, you just identified the teacher incentive as a $50,000 savings that you would have recommended. Or recommended regardless of whether
Correct.
we had the money restricted. And
But for example, the Woodford Reads, if we weren't in a budget situation, would I recommend canceling that? Doing away with that? Absolutely not. Anytime we can put books in the hands of our kids, we will do that every time we get a chance.
okay,
So if I didn't feel like that $25,000 was needed to reduce because of a deficit, I wouldn't have put it on there.
okay. And one of the other things that I wanted to look at was the summer reading program and the cost per pupil on the Tuesday, Thursday group and the Wednesday group. And kind of where that is at for, you know,
I don't have
cost.
those figures in front of me, so I think Martha provided
Got
that.
it like in total, but I don't have it per pupil.
Okay. It's, the numbers that I got, I mean, it's high. For 12 days of instruction, it is an expensive,
$188,000.
I know the overall cost of was what, 120 or 100 something
The
for the
overall
Tuesday,
cost.
Thursday was a little over 100,000.
Yeah, and then the Wednesday
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
60-ish, 55, 60,
Yeah.
something.
And the
Okay.
Tuesday, Thursday was for the target
Students
group.
under
Mhm.
25%.
So those were 100,000, and
Correct.
how many students attended?
So that was just.
I don't know that I ever had that number.
If the numbers that we were looking at were right, well, I'm not gonna speculate. I don't wanna throw it out a number and have it be incorrect, but
Here's the thing that I will say though, and I'm sure that the cost per student is much more higher. It is much higher. For struggling kids, it costs more to help move them forward.
sure.
So there is gonna be a difference, and probably a significant difference. And so, you know, again, I think that's something that the board has to analyze and to say, is that something we want to continue to do? Or do we want to do something different, or do you want to do away with it? I think the Wednesday has been a higher attendance because it has been a little bit more of just kind of an extra thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
And you've got more students, and I think when you look at the demographics of the students who attend the different programs, you'll see a very different demographic
On Wednesday.
on Wednesday compared to the Tuesday, Thursday. But again, if you're talking about your most struggling kids, the cost per kid's gonna be more. That's just a reality.
Sure.
Well, and they, but, you know, you laid out the three options very well, Mr. Hawkins. It's like, we could do away with it altogether. We could look at, I'd like to know how many kids attended. And one of the
We
things we did
provided
ask
that
last
figure.
year, yeah, and I'll go back and look at that, is that the best bang for the buck?
Yeah.
You know, is there another way to organize this, to do this, maybe spend less, maybe not spend less, but hit more kids? Because I think sometimes we do things and we think oh, this is great, you know, we're doing this great thing, but is it really the most effective thing for the kids? Could we reach more kids?
Well,
So those are,
Right, and again, I mean, I think
It's the
those
same.
are all questions, and I think we tried to address many of those.
right.
I
We
think
got
when
some
you look
data
at the
on
Tuesday,
there.
Thursday, I think we did experience some success with those students. And again, those are the struggling students. Where you run into a lot of the costs is the transportation.
Yep.
And so if you do away with transportation, then how many kids then would not be able to be served?
Right.
And so it's, what do you,
I do
So
think it's
there
a
were
question of what you value
158
as a district, and I would say that when you are talking about struggling kids, you can either pay upfront or you can pay on the back end. Because if you're not getting those kids up to the right reading level at the young age when you need to do that, then you are gonna pay in lost revenue for their entire life. You're gonna pay in graduation rates throughout their entire life. You're gonna pay, you can either kind of try to tackle that problem up front. And I'm not saying that we're doing it in the most effective way. I believe, based on the data that Martha presented, that we're doing it in a very good way.
I
But
think
I
for
do
the
think
kids
it's
that
important
attend,
to
they're
kind of look
benefiting.
at the different programs. I don't have a problem with that. I would just say, I don't think that we should cut any programs for low-income kids or anyone in this county simply to take that money to build, basically a subpar high school. I don't think you take that money out and then make the cuts because you took it out. If that money's restored, we're looking at no cuts. Your recommendation, the first recommendation, not the alternate, the first recommendation doesn't address canceling or cutting any of those programs. It simply says, let's restore the funds and then get back on out of deficit spending, get back on fiscal responsible ground, and then, look at different programs and different things. I don't have a problem looking at programs at all, but I will say, when you're looking at cutting programs that benefit our low-income students, our struggling students, our GAP students, that is what our whole CDIP is about. That's what our whole district is about, is providing services so that we have equality and equity. And so I would just caution that cutting those types of programs, or really any programs that we currently have, or any staff that we currently have, simply to build a building, is just the wrong way to go about doing that.
Any
So,
other questions?
there were 158 students that attended at least one day on the Tuesday, Thursday programs. The average was 7 of the 12 days that they came to both. And that's 4 hours of instructional time after transportation, and Ms. Jones, or Dr. Jones said, removing like mealtime, transportation, and the more kind of fun parts of their day. They averaged 4 hours of instructional time. So the Wednesday group is so much higher that it's really hard to, like you said, to figure out the.
How many students went to ed? 158 went to the Tuesday, Thursday. What does the Wednesday?
She was adding that up still and was gonna get back to me because it's tough to, she was having trouble figuring out like the crossover and not recounting those Tuesday, Thursday kids. You almost have to go back and look, so she was gonna get back.
Because some kids went all 3 days.
Right.
So it was to really just show the Wednesday only to try, which is
And
somewhat
again, a side benefit was
That's
the
what-
summer feeding too, so the summer feeding that you mentioned,
Which would happen regardless, because that's funded.
it wouldn't happen regardless.
Who funds the summer feeding program, Amy?
Federal government.
Yeah.
But we don't have to have it. There have
But
been
you're
years we
talking about
haven't.
opportunity and availability is, I think, the key difference.
Yeah, and so like when you have a program in a school, you have more kids take advantage
Okay.
You
of
take-
that. And
Right.
so you serve, like we serve a whole lot more meals at our sites on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday
Yeah.
than we do on Monday and Fridays.
Okay.
Still is available, it's just opportunities
Yeah.
lower.
And the other thing that came up was that sometimes the summer reading program is difficult to staff,
Can be.
understandably. And I don't think, I'm not looking at this from an advocacy for eliminating a program to fund a high school. I was looking at this as evaluating whether or not it's a good
Use of
use of funds.
resources.
Just to
And
clarify
look
that,
at
that's
data
not,
too, yeah, we always need to look at our data, and we've done that, so.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, Danny, and I think, and I didn't take it that way,
okay,
so.
I don't wanna,
I think we all have the best intentions, so.
But it's a limited pool of money and we need to spend it in the right places.
Any final questions for me?
Yeah, I have one quick question, and you may know this, or Scott might. Did we spend 50,000 on this teacher incentive this year?
We haven't all the way yet because we haven't paid it out.
Well,
It would-
we've paid 50 out so far. We
Oh,
have
really?
half of it still to go,
Okay.
and I'm not sure how
And
much that's gonna be.
what was your projection on that one, do you remember? When we
We
first
were
talked
hoping it
about
was gonna break even.
We were hoping that it was gonna break even.
What do you mean break
Really
even?
hasn't.
That-
Oh, with the
that we
sub.
could
That it would be
say-
It's hard to,
Yeah.
Right.
But it hasn't really helped
It
with the
hasn't.
sub, okay.
Right.
Okay.
That was
Good-
the
Good
thought.
shot, good shot, yeah,
it was
you
just,
don't know till you try, so, okay,
You know, something different, so,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
and again, you try these things and then evaluate,
And what we may end up having to do though is turn around and spend that money to increase sub-pay.
yeah.
You know, so it's, you,
And I still wonder about hiring well, that's not part of our agenda.
well, but I mean, but if you're talking about like a permanent sub or something like that, those are things we've talked about too.
Yeah.
And maybe those are, I mean, those, I think everything has to be on the table. And so we've tried this, it didn't work, so is there something else that might be better?
Okay, all right. Does anybody else have any specific questions for Ms. Smith? Thank you, Amy. Thanks for getting this to me.
And how many different sites did we offer for the summer feeding program? It was like 17?
Yeah, it was, they did all the schools, I don't know if they did the high school or the middle school, but they did all 4 elementaries. They did churches, they did vacation Bible schools, they did the library, they did Falling Springs, they did the Sunshine Camp out of Falling Springs. So Courtney has done a
Yeah.
remarkable job with that in terms of just finding places to really try to serve students who
Did
may
we-
not otherwise.
Well, and this is.
We served over
our-
14,000
yeah.
lunches last year, or meals.
Okay. Are there any questions on the budget or anything we want to talk about? I wanted to set these up so we could focus on the budget, focus on expenses and special meetings. I hope to have some more. I'm going to limit the agenda to that. If you want things on an agenda, happy to put him on the planning committee, or the planning meeting, which will be in 4 days. But I think as we address these, I just thought it would be helpful to do it. It's short tonight, if anyone doesn't have any other questions, but it's a good chance to get
I did have a
specific questions
request.
answered. Is it on the agenda? Does it have, yes, what is your request?
I would like to request, if Mr. Hawkins could get us, or Amy could get us, a, year-to-date total, over the past, not just years, but just since we restricted the money, a total dollar amount that we paid towards, the high school, the new high school expenses, like architect fees, any, like, way to do surveys, just a kind of a total, running total, so we can see how much we've spent on this project thus far. And I don't mean just this year, I mean, like, over the life of the project, just so we can kind of have a good idea about that expenditure, so that we will know, you know, moving forward exactly kind of what we're looking at, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there was something else I wondered if you could touch on in your thing on Monday.
Thank you, Amy.
I'll get it to you. All right, are there any questions for Mr. Hawkins about budget or expenses? I guess.
No, I think it's tough getting this, and I know that you probably didn't have an opportunity to send it before tonight, but I look forward to having a chance to look back and forth
Sure.
at the different things and kind of,
Sure. Yeah, we
read
got the
through this.
request on Friday, and Amy was out on Friday,
Sure.
so.
Well, and I think there's some new information from Frankfurt, at least with the House budget, that I don't know. Have you done any numbers on those, or we're just waiting to see? I think they're 1%
Yeah, we're looking at
raise
1% across the board, which,
and an increase in C.
yeah, it's very preliminary right now in terms of what we're looking at, but I don't know that the increase will cover those
our
costs,
adjustment.
Or 1%.
or the 1%. Yeah, I
Right.
don't know that
Well, we'll
it's,
have
And as our, I mean,
and if our assessments
Yes,
continue to
that's
go
what I
up,
was
then
gonna say.
more cost will be
is
passed on
will
us.
we even
So,
kind of
Yeah.
feel a seat
Right,
adjustment?
so, again, and I think it would be interesting, and that's not on the agenda tonight, so I want to talk about it, but just like what's going on in Frankfurt, we have a lot of passionate people in this county that may be interested in knowing those kinds of things and where their voices could be heard there too, so. If there's nothing else, does anybody else have anything on this topic?
Appreciate the information.
Thank you. We have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
Okay, so I'm gonna give Sherry the motion and Amber's the second.
And we'll vote.
We'll vote?
All those in
favor?
favor? Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.